Hey gang, today we're talking routers. Pound for pound, probably the most useful electrical hand tool in the shop. You can cut dados and rabbets, you can do decorative work, you can flush trim. Really a pretty amazing tool that you're gonna spend a fair amount of time with. Well, that begs the question, if I'm gonna spend that much time with such a versatile tool, maybe I wanna do a little better than Harbor Freight for this thing. Well, you might not. What I'm gonna do is just take you through the two Harbor Freight routers that I own, give you the sort of the pluses and minuses of them. You can make up your own mind whether you wanna go this direction or not. To start off with this little guy right here. This is the Drill Master 1/4" shank trim router. A trim router is definitely a luxury item when it comes to a shop. There's nothing that this router does that this router won't do. And the reverse is not true. This one has a lot of capabilities that this thing doesn't. But if you're doing a bunch of flush trim work or a bunch of roundovers in particular, a small router that you can run around with one hand that's narrow enough that it's reasonable to think about balancing it on the edge of a 3/4" sheet of plywood or something is a real handy thing to have. Luxury item tools are things that I don't have a lot of patience for. If you're gonna have something that you don't really need, it should at least work. This guy is sort of borderline on that regard. We can start by cleaning up a little bit. This trim router comes with an edge guide fence. This is the crookedest piece of metal I have ever taken out of a box. Get rid of it. It also comes with this, which is supposed to be a bearing that lets you do, flush trimming and rabbeting and things like that with router bits that don't have bearings. I haven't seen a flush trim or a rabbeting bit that doesn't have a bearing in 20 years, so goodbye. Comes with this little plastic doohickey. I don't even know what that is. And it comes with a replacement set of brushes, which I find rather optimistic. Somebody thinks that this router is gonna outlive the brushes that come in it. You probably ought to keep those. I'm not gonna. I zoomed in so you can get a little bit better look at this thing. The basic design of this trim router is much like almost every trim router. It has a one-piece motor and it has a base that you can run up and down to set the height of the bit. Fundamentally, this is the single biggest problem with this router. This base is completely acrylic. I'm gonna take it off for just a second. Set the motor aside. 100% plastic, the handles, the gears, everything. That's not necessarily terrible because you can see through acrylic, but it has a terrible time adjusting finely because of the play in this gear, and you have to crank this thing incredibly tight to get it to grip on the router, largely because the inside surface of this acrylic is so slippery. In fact, it was so bad that I ended up putting 2 layers of blue duct tape on the router motor just to beef up the diameter a hair and to give it some texture so that this acrylic had something to grip onto. The other issue is that you're supposed to set the height by cranking this knob up and down. It turns the gear, engages in the side of the motor. But it's the same shaft that tightens it down. So you can see here, if I don't hang on to this, as I tighten it and loosen it, it moves the router up and down. It's not the end of the world, especially for something like flush trimming. You don't care exactly what the bit height is. For roundovers, probably get away with it without it being too much fuss, but it would make this thing next to impossible to use for something critical like a dado. The other thing you need to know about this base is that for some inexplicable reason, the bottom of it is 2 pieces. The flat, smooth plate that it rides on is screwed into the rest of this acrylic gizmo. Now that in and of itself wouldn't be a problem except for the seam where the 2 pieces come together right here around the router bit doesn't seal up real well. And after about 5 seconds of routing, instead of a nice clear acrylic base, what you have is a bunch of sawdust packed in between the layers of this base, obscuring your view. It's an easy fix though. Just take the 4 screws out and get either silicone sealant or epoxy and actually glue this thing together with a seal right around where the bit goes. Screw it back together. There's no need for it to come apart functionally, so that'll make it a little bit stronger and it'll keep the dust out of the inside of the base. Now the motor itself is a very vanilla handheld router motor. It's actually pretty nice. It's a 2.4 amp motor, which is plenty of power for a handheld gizmo like this. The blue tape doesn't seem to have hurt it any. And as most handheld routers go, it's limited to 1/4" shank bits. It has a very, very standard 17mm nut and collet arrangement. Comes with both, of course. My only complaint with this thing is that it's a 2-wrench system to change the bits. There's a wrench for the router shaft and another wrench for the collet nut. The collet nut wrench is the same 17 millimeters that you find on a lot of 1/4-inch routers these days. And that's no big deal. There's plenty of room on this collet nut. If you lose this wrench, you know, go get your Craftsman or Snap-on or whatever normal 17 millimeter wrench and go to town. However, because this router does not have any sort of a spindle lock built into it, and you have to use this wrench, it becomes very important not to lose this wrench. Not because the width is so odd, I didn't check what it was, but because there's such a narrow space in here. You really need this wafer-thin wrench. You can see how much thinner that is than a normal wrench. And that's really about the only thing you've got room for in here. So if you get this router, don't lose this wrench. So when it's all said and done, this is a classic example of a Harbor Freight tool, right? It works, it routes, it removes wood. The kids' table and chairs that I just built in the last video had a lot of 1/4-inch round over linear surface. And I did all of it with this. And I did it successfully. It worked just fine. Yeah, there's a couple of things you need to do out of the box to make it, work, quite frankly, a whole lot better than it does the way it's supplied. But, some epoxy and some duct tape is not exactly the end of the world. So like all tools Harbor Freight, the really appealing thing about this trim router is its price. This thing is cheap. It's real cheap. It's considerably less than half the price of the next cheapest trim router that you can find if you go to a big box store. In fact, it's cheap enough that the price allows you to work around some of the little annoyances of the router by just getting more than one. Rather than having to set this up for a 1/4-inch round over bit and then fool with it to change it to a 3/8 round over bit, just get 2. Put your 1/4-inch bit in one, set it up, lock it down, forget about it. It's your 1/4-inch round over router. Put it on the shelf and never think about it again until maybe the bit gets dull or something. So moving on up, the other router that I have from Harbor Freight is the 1.5 horse Plunge Router. I have had this router for, could be as much as 2 years at this point, but they still sell exactly the same router with the exception that the case is now red for some reason. I've worked with most of the name brand routers that you find at Porter Cables, Milwaukee's, Makitas, DeWalt's, things like that. And I gotta tell you, while there are some convenience things, some pleasure to operate kind of things about the more expensive routers that you won't find on this, for the most part, this thing does a fantastic job. It's not my intention to do a commercial for this router, so I'm not going to run through all the features that it has. You can go to the website and look those things up. But just a couple of things I'll point out that the router has that actually work really well in case you were wondering. The switches, let me get the power cord out of the way here. The Velcro on the power cord, nice touch, right? Sometimes when you get really inexpensive tools, you get very persnickety switches. They're either too hard to push or they're too easy to push or the locking mechanism doesn't lock or something dumb like that. No problems like that here. The switch is exactly where you'd expect it to be over on the trigger grip. Sorry, lefties. The hold to lock it on locks every time you push it and has enough of a lip around it that it doesn't lock when you weren't trying to push it. This is the speed adjustment knob for this router. It goes from something to 25 or 28,000 RPM. And this is one of those areas where I fully expect to be aggravated by cheap tools. I have a Dremel tool where the adjustable speed knob, slider switch actually, is so loose that the vibration of the tool changes the speed all the time. Drives me insane. No problems like that with this one. This is loose enough that it can be moved with one finger without kind of even thinking about it, but it stays put. I have not encountered, even when I've run into knots or chatter or something where the router really wanted to start going, this speed stays put. Particularly, I don't know if you can hear this, but up at the very top speed, there's a click. So A, when you've gotten to it without looking at it, and B, when you're at the most power that this router has, there's that just extra little bit of something to make sure the speed knob stays put. The plunge mechanism on this router is exactly the same as it is on almost every plunge router these days. It has a 4-step turret with 1/4-inch steps between them. It has a depth rod here that you just set wherever you want for your depth. It has a useless scale on the front of it. Almost all of them are useless. I don't think that's a knock against this router. And at the top, it has a micro adjustment for the depth. This thing is calibrated, it's 1/64th of an inch per 1/4 turn. And I was surprised to find this, but this adjustment has an O-ring at the bottom of it. So it has, again, nice tension. It's not going to move on its own due to the vibration of the router, and it doesn't get sawdust up underneath there. So you can pretty reliably say, okay, I turned it 1/4 of a turn, that's a 1/64th of an inch. And the last thing I want to point out is this dust collection shroud that's on here. It can be removed. There's 2 screws you have to take out of the bottom. But I didn't remove mine because I tried it out, and you'd never believe this, but it actually kind of works. And don't get me wrong. The router has still got to be the messiest tool in the shop. It's right up there with the circ saw for taking a lot of dust and throwing it a long way. But this vacuum shroud comes down here, and first off, it comes in on the side that the bit is throwing the chips towards. So you've got the strongest vacuum on the correct side for collection. But it does come down here and spread the vacuum the whole way around the thing. It's not going to get everything. You're still going to have some router mess to clean up, but it is plenty of dust collection so that you can see what you're doing the whole time. You never get that big pile of chips and dust right around the bit that makes it so you have no idea what you're doing. I do, however, wish they had put the flat side of the base opposite the dust collection shroud, because as it stands now, if you try to put a straight edge along here, unless it's real low profile like the saw guide I have up there, if you use any kind of a thick piece of wood as a straight edge, you can't get up against the straight edge because the dust collection shroud's in the way. Okay, so there's the nickel tour of my 2 Harbor Freight routers. In all honesty, anything that I didn't talk about, it's because there's really nothing different about these routers from any other sort of run-of-the-mill router. We'll see about the longevity of these Harbor Freight routers. It may turn out to be terrible, but I've had this one for 2 years. I've used it quite a bit. I haven't had a single problem with it. If it dies today, I'm probably going to go to Harbor Freight and get myself a red one. Well, there you go, YouTube. Matt's 2 cents on Harbor Freight routers. If you got questions or comments, leave them below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And as always, especially if you're going to play with cheapo routers, stay safe, YouTube.